Today, apologist. Have you ever heard this question asked before? Isn't the Bible just a bunch of fairy tales? This is an appropriate question that you'll probably hear quite a lot, and of course, it's important to ask and inquire more information from the person asking the question when they mean fairy tales. But assuming they're talking about the New Testament, they're referring to the miracles and the actions of Jesus, the disciples, and the works that they did after Jesus' death and resurrection, the Holy Spirit, the book of Revelations, and so forth. So, when we go and unpack this, I've done 6 videos, 3 on the Old Testament, 3 on the New Testament. And you could go to my playlist section and check out the original videos there. There's a lot of information to share and a lot of information to unload and to process. Now I'm breaking this video up, though it's my final video, into 2 sections. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we're talking about tests today. Testing what the writers wrote. This is kind of like being put on the stand and being basically, tested and questioned. And I'm doing the first 4 in this video, and then on Thursday I'm going to be doing 5 through 8 through there. And I'm doing it because I want to help you guys to process the information, to use the information, and there's just a lot of stuff to talk about. So with that said, let's get into it. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is the intention test. The intention test evaluates whether the Gospels were written with the intention of being treated like it was history. Things that are not history, fairy tales and things like that, they tend to be exaggerated. They tend not to be written down like it's a historical narrative. They're things that are just red flags that tell you, even if they're using history pieces, it's just not real. And they use outlandish things that happen, or blatant mythology kind of stuff. And when you compare the intention test to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see that that's not the case. They tend to write with humble fashion, with responsibility, accurate details of incidents, and passionate care. And that's stuff that you're supposed to look for in historical narratives. So whether or not you agree that the disciples, really, what they wrote down was really true, they believe that it was true when you compare it to the intention test. The second one is the ability test. So the ability test basically examines whether the people that wrote the stuff, if it's a historical document, whether they were actually there at that time or it can be trusted. Now, as we look at the writers Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see 2 interesting things. One, they were either directly connected to the events, or they were associated or friends with the people that were directly connected to the event. For example, Matthew and John both are highly considered to be disciples of Jesus, the original 12. Matthew's a little more debated, but John is highly believed, and I believe John to be one of the original 12 disciples. Mark and Luke. Mark was associated with Peter, and when he wrote his letter, Peter was, speaking to him and giving him, what had happened. And Luke was an associate of Paul's, who wrote down as an eyewitness that Jesus literally spoke to Paul and through the conversion of the road to Damascus. Now, one of the things that skeptics will say about the ability test about Christians or the Gospels is that it can't be trusted because of the time in which things happened and the time it was written. There's just too much time. Well, John wrote somewhere in 30 AD to 36 or 37 AD, the Gospel account of John. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke come before John, which is closer to the events of when Jesus died and resurrected, which was early century AD. So if it's the longest Gospel account is only 30 to 35 years, I'm sorry, but if I was alive about 30, 35 years after World War II, I wouldn't be questioning it. The church had a major impact historically on the world at their time. They were considered a cult and all these things by the Roman Empire and the Jews, as well. So we need to apply that. Plus, Jewish people didn't write down a lot of things. They had to memorize everything, and they had to speak orally to people. So a lot of the reasons why we don't find a lot of manuscripts is simply because in the ability test, a lot of the Jewish people memorized by head and spoke. Now the character test, this is pretty self-explanatory. Whether or not these people had evil intentions. Did they maliciously intend to produce altered version of what really happened in history? For the gospel writers, when I look at the Gospels, I don't see that in which they failed the character test. You know, these guys, they had a lot to lose and not a lot to gain. And they taught a lot of moral, ethical things. So people that suggest that they don't pass the test, are you suggesting that these guys who wrote some really morally ethical things, let's just take Jesus and God out of the equation, were super unethical? That doesn't really tend to happen with people. And it tends to get found out pretty quickly if they're false. Second, you know, they lost a lot. Of the 11 disciples, only one of them survived. The rest were martyred and killed. They had no gain socially, and they had no gain money-wise by being Christians. The last thing is the consistency test. Now, the consistency test basically says, do the stories connect well? Do they piece together? Now, with a consistency test, you need to use discrepancies. So, like the gospel, you know, the accounts of Jesus' his resurrection has different, you know, information. The women were there. Certain names of women were there. An angel was there. Jesus showed up. But they all, that, you know, though those are slight discrepancies, the main narrative is the core is the same. Jesus wasn't there when they got there. The tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away. The soldiers were missing, and somebody or something came to them and spoke to them. And they went back and told the disciples that Jesus was risen, or was not. It was not in the tomb, at least. We also see this with the consistency test with Matthew. Matthew claims that Jesus speaks to a centurion, and Luke testifies that Jesus has a conversation with his representatives. Now, Luke is probably the more correct of the two, and though this is a discrepancy, Jesus is still speaking somewhat to a centurion, though whether it's representatives or he's there was somebody there. And Luke, historically speaking, that's probably what the centurion did, the Roman commander. In all the stories of Jesus, when we look at the consistency test, we see that it passes. We don't want the narratives to sound identical because detectives get suspicious and people usually get suspicious when the stories are exactly the same. The gospel accounts come from different perspectives and analyze different information. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and hit the notification button every Tuesday and Thursday I post videos. And make sure you join me on Thursday as I finish this up. I thank everybody for supporting me. Enjoy the rest of the videos. And hey, give these tests a try. God bless and have a great day.